Welcome to Capitol View on WSIU. I'm Brian Sapp. I'm a reporter here in Carbondale with WSIU Radio. I'll be your host today. The Illinois General Assembly is on break this week. Last week, we saw the typical flurry of bills being voted out of each chamber. We were trying to watch and see which ones were going to make it and which weren't. With that being said, that there were a few that did not make it. We'll talk about some of the bills that did and some that didn't and whether they still have a chance. And a Northern Illinois Democratic congressman made a visit here to Southern Illinois in Carterville, and we'll find out what brought him to some solidly Republican territory. Joining us this week to cover what's happening in Springfield and around the state are Mawa Iqbal of WBEZ and Jeremy Gorner of the Chicago Tribune. Hi guys, glad to have you here. First question, Mawa, I wanted to jump right into some of the bills that passed last week. Last year, Sangamon County Deputy Sean Grayson was charged with the murder of Sonia Massey after she was shot in her home after they responded to a call. There were several bills that passed out of the legislature last week, I believe, out of the Senate. What are those bills and what do they hope to accomplish?
Yeah, so like you said, Brian, after her shooting death, there was a real groundswell movement from community activists to get something done, right? To get some reforms passed. And so they turned to State Senator Doris Turner, who's actually not only from Springfield, and so like Sonia Massey was one of her constituents, but also actually knew the Massey family. She said that she'd met Sonia before her death and that she knew her mom and knew the Massey family going back multiple generations, actually. So, for her, it was a really personal, obviously very, very personal issue. And her death, I think, affected her a lot. And so when she got into the legislature, when the session started, Senator Doris Turner introduced these two reform bills that, like you said, passed the Senate. One would essentially make the standards for background checking potential applicants or potential hires at law enforcement agencies a lot stricter. So basically, according to the legislation, the applicants for police jobs would have to essentially allow their previous law enforcement employers to turn over, background investigation materials, physical and psychological fitness, any investigations into misconduct, like all work performance records, like all sorts of things, before they're even authorized to go forward with the application process. And the reason for this was because after the shooting took place, through like journalism and through a lot of like community members and just looking into what happened, it was revealed that the then Sheriff's Deputy Sean Grayson had received quite a few disciplinary infractions at his different agencies that he was employed at. And the only reason he was really hired at Sangamon County was because he got a good recommendation from a former Sangamon County law enforcement personnel. And so, a lot of the community members were saying, if there were like stricter background checking standards, then maybe Sean Grayson wouldn't have been hired. And so that's one of the bills. The other one is a little bit more focused on elections. And so this one was something that, after the shooting death, a lot of people who were upset about Sean Grayson being hired pointed to the sheriff as being responsible, right? That Sean Grayson was hired under then Sheriff Jack Campbell. And people, of course, were calling for his resignation. They were calling for him to step down. And initially he didn't. But eventually, just with enough community pressure and criticism, he did step down. And so a lot of community members felt like this was a situation where, if something like this were to happen again, which obviously the hope was that it never does, but if something like this were to happen again, and, there's a sheriff who, kills someone, and then the sheriff, decides, okay, well, I'm not going to take responsibility for it, then people wanted to have some sort of recourse to essentially recall the sheriff. And so in the second bill that Senator Doris Turner introduced and has now passed the Senate, basically it would create a path for Sangamon County to institute recall elections for the 2026 election. It would essentially make a way for the county to put that question of should we have recall for countywide officials on the 2026 ballot.
Thanks, Mala, for that. One clarification. So this bill, the second bill about the recalls, would set it up so that Sangamon County could then, their voters could say whether or not they want to institute the recall. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's not, like should this person, like for example, the new sheriff, should they be recalled in 2020 during the 2026 election? It's just should we have recall? And as like a yes or no ballot question for the 2026 November election.
Okay. And then Jeremy, you were saying a little bit that you're telling me a little bit about, not to get too much into the weeds, but there was an amendment on this bill?
Yeah, there were a couple. There were actually a couple. So, for one thing, one iteration of the bill exempted the office of county treasurer and regional school administrators that could span multiple counties from this recall bill. Those two positions were exempt initially, but then in the final product before it passed the Senate, those exemptions were stripped out. The reason those exemptions were there in the first place is because for county treasurer and apparently a regional school administrator, there's already a mechanism in place to recall those positions, but those exemptions were still taken out before the Senate passed it. And then the other thing too is Senator Turner had said that she wanted this recall bill to apply more broadly to other counties, to all the other counties, in Illinois, except for Cook County, which has its own process. But her goal was, she needed to do justice, she said, for the Massey family, and the only way to do it was to pass something. So that's a big reason that this bill, as passed through the Senate, only applies to Sangamon County.
Okay, all right. Well, I guess we'll see what happens next in the House. Jeremy, while we're talking to you, I wanted to move on. Going to talk about a bill that did not pass, but it didn't get the support it needed to get out of the House. But from what I read, it was the resentencing youth offender bill. From what I read, Speaker Welch this year was really trying to make sure that the bills before he brought them to the floor had the votes they needed. And this one sounded like it did, but ended up not having them. Can you tell us a little bit about the bill and then kind of what happened on its failure?
Sure. Yeah. So basically, what this legislation would have done is it would have provided another pathway for people who've been in prison for lengthy periods of time for crimes they committed when they were under 21 to have another pathway for early release. This kind of goes to the heart of an issue called retroactivity, which has been pretty controversial in the General Assembly for years. Retroactivity meaning, granting early release for people who are incarcerated for especially heinous crimes and for other crimes, in which they serve for many years. It's controversial because a lot of law and order types believe that once you're sentenced, you're sentenced. There should be a finality to your sentence, and it does not do justice for victims who would have to relive any kind of efforts for early release, all over again. Victims of their families, basically. So it's been very controversial, but nonetheless, there have been efforts in recent years to pass retroactive sentencing reform. A couple of years ago, natural life without parole, a sentence of natural life without parole was abolished in the General Assembly, where now anyone who was sentenced to natural life could, be eligible for parole after serving 40 years in prison. And the same goes for youthful parole, where after serving 10 years or 20 years for most crimes, anyone who was in prison for crimes that they were convicted of committing when they were under 21, they would be eligible for parole. But those two pieces of those two laws I mentioned are not retroactive. What this law would do, what this legislation would have done, is that it would have allowed anyone who's under 21 who committed a crime when they were under 21 still in prison to wait for most crimes to wait 10 years before they themselves could petition the courts for early release. And one of the things the courts would have to consider is their, age and maturity at the time the crime occurred. This kind of goes to research that proponents have cited about what the world now knows about brain science and adolescence and lack of maturity for young adults. This, of course, was something that was this whole concept, though, has been downplayed again by law and order types who still believe that a law like this doesn't do any justice for victims who would have to essentially relive these hearings all over again. So what happened is that this bill, so State Rep Teresa Ma, she's a Chicago Democrat, carried this bill, and she had told me that before the bill had 27 co-sponsors on the on the House Democratic side, going into last week. And before it went onto the House floor, State Rep Ma basically told me that she had the necessary 60 votes to basically bring it to the House floor. 60 votes is an informal threshold that House Speaker Emanuel Chris Welch, basically dictates that when he dictates what bills get to go to the House floor, he likes this 60 vote threshold because that really means that if there's 60 Democrats who are aboard, then they would have an automatic majority. The bill would have an automatic majority for passage. So Ma basically thought that she had the 60 votes, but when it came down to it during the vote, she failed to get 60. There were 49 in favor and 51 opposed. So as a result, in rare fashion, the bill was defeated on the House floor.
Okay. Is there an opportunity for it to come back, or are they going to try for another session maybe?
Well, it's really hard to tell now. I know that advocates were weighing their options, to see. I mean, it could be taken up at in another session. I mean, we are at the start of a brand new 2-year session for the legislature, so we'll see what happened. But I think it's important to note that this issue, because I talked about retroactivity and how controversial it has been in the General Assembly, it really underscored a political divide between progressives and moderates within the Democratic Party, especially when it comes to criminal justice reform issues. You saw the Democrats who voted against it were Democrats who represent districts where a lot of first responders live or have direct ties to first responders themselves, either because of a family connection or because they were one, or Democrats from the suburbs, where the ones the Democrats who favored it were largely progressives and, from the city of Chicago. As well. So I guess we'll have to stay tuned, Brian, to see what happens.
Okay. Yeah. That's a lot of what I read too, is that the split between the progressives and the more moderates. So we'll see what they're able to work out. Moving on to another bill, the Senate passed a bill, not to downplay it, about the smell of, or the storage of cannabis and its smell. It goes back to a Illinois Supreme Court decision last year. But Mawa, could you kind of fill us in? How does the smell of cannabis play into this bill?
Yeah, so essentially this is Senator Rachel Ventura's bill, and she's a Democratic senator. She's done a lot of criminal justice and related bills. And so this one it's interesting because essentially it says that, a requirement that's in place right now where you have to store your cannabis in an odor-proof sealed container while you're driving, that this bill would essentially get rid of that requirement and would basically say that, it's the smell of weed is not probable cause enough for a law enforcement officer to search a car. It's interesting because proponents of this bill and Senator Ventura and other Democrats who are in favor of this bill, we're talking about how, that there is a racial and a social justice component to this, right? They're saying that data shows that unfortunately, oftentimes Black drivers are pulled over in these pretextual traffic stops and law enforcement officers will use the smell of cannabis as a way to search their car and to try to get them for something, like attack on another criminal charge or whatever. And I think it's interesting, during the debate, what I would hear too from people who are in support of this bill is that, even if you're coming back from a dispensary, where you're buying legal cannabis and they give it to you in a bag, sometimes those bags aren't odor proof, or sometimes the dispensaries themselves smell like weed. And so if you were to sit in your car immediately after coming back from a dispensary and then and you have your windows down, the police officer nearby smells you, then they could think like, oh, well, then this person must be high, even though you're just coming from a dispensary and not actually partaking. But of course, a lot of the opposition was that, this will lead to more DUIs, that this will give people more license to just feel okay to smoke weed while they're in the car or just before they get in the car and start driving. A lot of the opponents, which are mostly like Republican lawmakers too, brought up that the reason why we had this requirement was to bring weed up to parity with our alcohol laws. So like in Illinois, you can't have an open container of beer, for example, like just in your side console. And so, it's interesting, but I think because like there's enough Democrat support, it probably will also just pass in the House. But the debate has been pretty interesting around it. And yeah, like you mentioned too, last December, the Supreme Court of Illinois ruled that the smell of raw cannabis actually is enough probable cause for police to search a vehicle. So it'll be interesting, like once, or if I should say, if this bill were to pass, then to become law, how that affects, what the courts do, and then also what police officers then do.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Another bill that passed last week in the newsroom, we saw the bill that passed, I believe, out of the Senate about restricting mascots that were based on people with disabilities. And then on Friday, the House, I believe, passed a bill that would ban Native American mascots. And Jeremy, I believe you said you wrote something about that on this past weekend. Can you tell us a little bit about the issue and what happened?
Yeah, so I did a story, Brian, where I combined the two bills because they basically touch on the issue of discrimination, with respect to school mascots, and regardless of whether it's discriminatory against Native Americans or elsewhere. So basically, these two bills passed through the House, mostly along party lines. And, this follows a wave of schools and professional sports teams over the last 20 years that have scaled back their usage of Native American themed names, imagery, mascots, and logos. But the issue, and this would affect primarily elementary through high schools. And the bill calls for banning schools from using Native American names, logos, or mascots that include federally recognized tribes, historical Native American people or tribal groups in their insignia. It calls for prohibiting terms such as Redskins, Braves, Chieftains, Chiefs, Tribe, and Indians from being used and barring depictions of feathered headdresses, tomahawks, arrowheads or spears, arrows or other weapons, etc. I'm basically citing the statute as it was in my story.
Yeah.
So if this bill were to become law, the measure would allow schools to continue using these uniforms or any materials with these names until September of 2030. But there is a caveat.
Okay.
The caveat here, though, is that the bill doesn't carry any penalties if schools ignore the measure. So State Representative Maurice West, who backed both bills, acknowledged that neither bill really contains any enforcement mechanisms, but his hope is that local school boards will abide by these measures. So what this really bill does is it kind of furthers the conversation on these controversial mascots that we've seen. I believe the most Illinois-centric example that's out there is, Chief Illinois. University of Illinois rid itself of Chief Illinois in the mid 2000s following years of protests. And we've seen NFL teams. We've seen the NFL team, the Washington Redskins, change to the Commanders, and in Major League Baseball, Cleveland changed their name to the Guardians from the Indians. These are recent examples, and we see this in schools all over the state. Although not proportionally, there's like maybe 90 out of the thousands that are out there, public schools in Illinois. So it's a small percentage, but it still does exist. So that's kind of what this bill addresses. But again, there really isn't a lot of teeth to it unless school boards, come on board. And if they do come on board, the idea is they would have this legislation to refer to. The second piece of legislation, um, piece of legislation doesn't deal with the Native American community. It's called the Prohibition of Discriminatory Disability Mascots Act, and this really only targets one school down in the Metro East area. It's Freeburg Community High School, and basically basically here the nickname is considered by proponents of this bill as a dwarfism slur. They're called the midgets. But according to the school's website, the midgets moniker, it's been around 90 years, and it was given to a basketball team at the high school by a sports writer because of their, because they were, despite their short height, they were winning a lot of games. And, the website calls this an affectionate and respectful label. This has been kind of a tradition in Freeburg for 90 years. But nonetheless, there have been proponents who have wanted to get rid of this bill, who want them to change their name because they feel like it's discriminatory against little people. And so basically, the school may continue, according to this legislation, the school may continue using uniforms or other materials with this name up until 2028. But again, this is going to be contingent on whether local school boards want to want to get rid of the mascot and change the name, which seems very highly unlikely from what I've been told, or could ascertain at this time. I know there was a lot of resistance from the state rep who represents Freeburg in that area. He basically said on the House floor that the community is proud of the mascot. They love the mascot. And all the stores in town are going to sell the shirts, and that it's not going to have the effect that the Democrats in the legislature, that they want. But nonetheless, you have Democrats who their impetus for voting in favor of this bill in the House is they've called the mascot name divisive and harmful. So we'll see what happens. Again, these are both bills that don't have an enforcement mechanism or penalties set forth in them, in the legislation, and they're leaving it up to the local governments to do something about this if they wish. But also, it's important to note that it's only passed the House, so we'll have to see what happens in the Senate with both of these bills.
Okay, yeah, we'll look forward to that. Now we've got just a little bit of time left, and Jeremy, I wanted to stick with you. You wrote an article with another colleague of yours from the Tribune. Sean Casten is a Illinois Democratic representative, U.S. representative. He came down to our area down here in Carterville, which is really red. Can you tell, we got a little bit of time, can you tell me about that and what it means?
Yeah, so Sean Casten, he's a Democrat from the Chicago suburbs. He came down to do a town hall in Carterville, which is next to Carbondale. That comes a day earlier. He was in Dixon, Illinois, which was the boyhood home of former President Ronald Reagan, another red area of the state. Basically, his aim with these town halls was to kind of make up ground that he feels that Democrats in his position feel Republicans have lost when they've tried to go back to their districts, back to their own red districts, to basically address concerned citizens about policies that President Donald Trump wants to enact, which would include the loss of federal funding, the possible loss of federal funding in many areas, including Medicaid, Social Security, and other areas. Both areas of funding that Democrats have feared could happen, where you have Republicans who've been downplaying it, saying that Trump has not said that. Well, Republican congressmen have had to go all over the country back to their districts in light of this rhetoric from the president, and really face a lot of angry constituents, when they go back to their home districts, over what Trump may do. and one of the Republican congressmen, who's head of the GOP's Congressional Campaign Committee, basically told his Republican colleagues to stop holding these in-person town hall meetings because of the anti-Trump protesters, and also just, there's, like I said, there's been a lot of concerned and angry people about what may or may not, or what may happen. So Democrats so Sean Casten's been trying to take advantage of this basically by going to red districts. He has nothing to lose. He doesn't represent people in this district. He's a Democrat, and it's almost like, well, it's a foregone conclusion. They're not going to support me. But when he came to Carterville, he encountered about 120, 130 people at John A. Logan College who were pretty favorable to what he had to say. And basically, he was trying to talk about, what impacts. He did talk a little bit about what these impacts could have on, like, what Trump's policies could have on, on the people, the way he sees it, the negative impacts. But it really was more to kind of educate people about these issues, about Medicaid and Social Security, and what budget blueprint has been voted on in Congress, what that's about, just a lot of different things. And
Okay. Sorry to interrupt you, but we've got to wrap it up there. And I really appreciate it. And I have seen that in my own reporting here that people want to talk to their representatives. Mawa and Jeremy, thank you for your time. And that's it for this week's edition of Capitol View. Join us next week. And thanks on behalf of Mawa, Iqbal, and Jeremy Goring. Thanks.